I never thought that Nate and I would argue about this, but it seemed like it was going to be a long time, just the two of us living together, breathing the same air. But finding the words to say to each other was getting harder and 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 harder. I didn't know what was causing it. Maybe it was building up like a compressed spring that was about to break, but one thing was clear. Something inside us had broken, maybe forever. Nate, as usual, sat with a look of indifference on his face, slightly frowned and put his hands on his chest, as if he was already preparing to defend himself against all my words, even those that had not yet been spoken. You don't even try to understand what's happening to me. He looked at me like I was a schoolgirl who was guilty in front of a strict teacher, but there was no compassion or pity in his eyes. Maybe because you're always complaining? I come home from work, and instead of a normal evening, I'm met by your constant reproaches and discontent. He replied, looking up at the ceiling, as if trying to find patience in his cold, indifferent white stripes. I felt a wave of indignation rise up inside me. All my attempts to tell him how bad I was were like hitting a wall. Every word, every phrase I uttered, it was as if I had stumbled upon a stone. He didn't understand that I lacked love and warmth, that I couldn't stay in this endless frame of indifference anymore. If for you my feelings are just complaints, then what are you still doing here? Maybe you'd be better off living alone and not listening to me? I cried out, feeling tears come into my eyes. And those tears were from disappointment, not pain, disappointment in the person that I had once connected my life with. And Nate, without losing his composure, stood up and looked at me, tired, and said, "You know, I'm tired of all this. If you want to complain, find someone else to do it. Mabia Frian." He turned sharply and left the living room, heading for his office, where he spent most evenings hiding behind a computer screen, not noticing how I kept becoming a stranger to him. I wanted to run away, to run out of the house, to get as far away from this place as possible, where everything had become a cold routine. So I grabbed my jacket, put it on my shoulders, and I went outside, barely noticing the cold air burning my face. And I was walking fast, not knowing where I was going until I was on the beach. This empty space by the water was a kind of refuge for me, a place where I could be alone with myself and try to figure out what to do next. And the cool air slightly cooled my anger, and the sound of my footsteps on the bridge seemed like a melody of loneliness that I had heard for too long. I looked up and I looked at the lights of the city across the river, and I thought maybe Nate and I are just neighbors, and maybe I was just afraid to admit it, but now it's like a handshake, and I hear a little footstep next to me, and my first thought is to walk away, not to pay attention, but something stops me, and a stranger who is passing by turns around and sees me, and suddenly slows down a little bit. He was tall, wearing a sports jacket, his dark hair slightly torn by the wind, and his eyes were the same kind of attention I missed at home. He smiled unobtrusively, and it was as if he read my condition right away. "It's cold today, isn't it? But I guess sometimes I need this walk." His voice was so soft, so quiet, as if he really understood that I needed a little silence to come to my senses. I nodded. not expecting this chance encounter to touch me so much. Yes, sometimes you need to be alone. My voice was quieter than I thought, but for some reason it didn't seem to interfere with what he was hearing. You know, sometimes walking helps even more than talking, he said, stopping by and looking at the water. Although sometimes it seems that talking is what takes the burden off my mind, I looked at him again and suddenly felt that I could trust this person. We talked about the little things, and I forgot all my problems. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know why his words were so comforting, but I felt relieved. This chance meeting on the beach became something special for me. We talked for a few more minutes, and his words were warm, sincere. His name was Sean, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine attention. And that night I was coming home, and for the first time in a long time, my heart was calm, and the next morning everything seemed ordinary, almost gray, but the memory of Sean, that random stranger on the beach, somehow kept me going. When Nate left for work without even kissing me goodbye, I felt nothing but a calm emptiness. No reproach, the familiar feeling of colorlessness that filled our space. But the thought of meeting Sean kept coming back to me, and there was something about it, something new, something tender, something that made me feel alive. And I had this sudden desire to see him again, this absurd, illogical desire, like my life was like this endless gray corridor, and Sean was barely a visible light at the end of it. No, it's just a moment of weakness, I kept telling myself, but somewhere deep inside me, I was already feeling the desire to experience again the feeling he gave me. I wanted to take a little detour, sit in the corner with a book, away from the people I knew, and forget, but I saw a familiar figure by the window, and my heart stopped for a moment. It was Sean. My fingers reached automatically to the phone to check the time, and I noticed my hands trembling. Hello, I told myself, but something inside me was telling me not to pass by, that this wasn't just a chance encounter. My life had been woven into a rut for too long, and I might have deserved a little bit of a different reality, even for a moment. It was as if, upon sensing my gaze, he turned around and, recognizing me, smiled. He waved his hand to me, asking me to come over. "Jenny, right?" he said as I approached. "Good to see you again. I think fate has decided to play its game with us." "Sean," he smiled. "It's a surprise. I thought these coincidences only happen in the movies." He gestured to me to sit down, and I suddenly realized how easy it was for me to do that. There was no awkwardness, as with new acquaintances, just a calm, pleasant feeling of acceptance. Sean was completely different, open, calm, and really good at listening. To be honest, I can't get that meeting out of my head. Suddenly I confessed to myself, and I felt myself being flooded with redness. Sean laughed softly, as if he understood my embarrassment. "That's nice to hear. And I think I feel the same way." And that said, it took us to a whole new level of honesty, and we started talking about what we're missing in life, about the little things that always seem small, but sometimes they define everything. And he was telling me about his past, about how there were times in his life when he felt like an outsider among people he knew. I found in his words the echo of my own feelings, the warm, quiet pain of loneliness that seemed to permeate every cell of my mind. We talked for hours, and I didn't notice how quickly the time passed. At some point, he offered to take a walk, and I thought nothing of it, and I said yes. We left the cafe and walked down the street talking about all kinds of things, and I felt like everything that was hurting and holding me back was coming back to me. And Sean was telling me about his family, how he was close to his sister, but life had torn them apart, and he was talking about loneliness as if it was someone he knew who would come up to him and take his breath away. I was listening, nodding, and I was immersed in his words, and at some point, it struck me that there really are people in this world that you could be honest with without fear of it being used against you. Maybe it's just a whim of fate, but for some reason it seems that you understand me in a way that others can't. His words touched me in my life. No one has spoken to me so sincerely and openly in a long time. No one has opened his soul to me like he did, as if he wasn't afraid that it would make him vulnerable. I guess fate really does sometimes like to play games like this. I smiled, feeling my heart stop. But can you believe her after all these disappointments? Maybe not, he thoughtfully replied. But sometimes you want to give yourself a chance. We were standing next to each other, and the silence filled the space between us. It was light, almost familiar. I suddenly caught myself looking at something I couldn't take my eyes off of, and I felt something growing inside me that looked like excitement, a sweet anticipation. It was like the world around me was starting to get the brightness and the color that I was missing, and that night, when I got home, I was met by the emptiness again, and Nate was already home, sitting in a chair obsessed with his phone, and he didn't even look at me when I walked in. Everything was as it always was. His silence, his alienation, the familiar walls that kept me from breathing. But I had a different image in my head. The image of Sean's warm eyes, his quiet, encouraging smile, his words, said sincerely, without any backward thought, and I felt something new, tender, and unexpected growing inside me. It was like maybe I had a chance for something better, and the next morning, when I woke up, I immediately remembered last night and the conversation with Sean, and I kept thinking about him over and over again all day, like everything that had happened to me before I met him seemed to be part of some other life. And whoever he was, this random stranger, he had changed something. I felt guilty, like I had betrayed Nate, but I couldn't handle it. And Nate was sitting at the kitchen table, distracted and focused on his phone, which he was about to take off to get his coffee. And we had a few conversations about the water bill, the meetings next week, and what to buy at the supermarket. It was the same as always, but now it was like an invisible wall between us. I couldn't get it out of my mind how easy and free it was to talk to Sean. After breakfast, I left the house under the pretext of having to go for a walk. The weather was sunny, but the wind was strong, and the air felt burning fresh. As I walked down the street, I began to think that maybe Sean and I would never see each other again. After all, it was just a chance conversation, a little coincidence, nothing more. But my heart stopped at the thought that I might meet him again. I almost automatically went towards the cafe where we had accidentally met yesterday. I convinced myself that I just wanted to have a coffee, but I realized that I didn't. I could see his smile, his calm, encouraging look, his words about how sometimes meetings don't just happen. And I walked into the coffee shop and I saw him. And Sean was sitting at the same window table, thinking, but he looked up when he saw me, and we met, and I felt my heart beat harder. He smiled, not as wide as last time, but still warm and soft. "Jenny," he said, standing up and slightly bowing his head as if to greet. I think fate really did have something in mind. I smiled, feeling a little nervous, and sat down opposite him. "Well, now I can hardly disagree," I answered, laughing. "If that's a coincidence, it's very persistent." He looked at me, and I felt again that I wanted to be honest with him, to share what was bothering me inside. Sean was the kind of person who listened without judgment, and I felt like he really understood me. We got back into the conversation, like we were picking up where we left off yesterday, and at some point I decided to confess, "You know, Sean, I don't often feel this comfortable with someone. In fact, I don't even remember the last time I could talk to someone so simply." Sean nodded. His eyes were focused but warm. "It's probably one of those rare feelings when you feel like the person you're talking to really understands you," he responded quietly, without taking his eyes off me. We talked about everything, about his travels, about how he recently moved to this city in search of new opportunities, about his passion for photography, and Sean said that he loves to take pictures of people and moments, try to capture something in the lens that others don't notice. I was amazed at how passionately he talked about it, and I realized that I wasn't just interested in listening to him. I wanted to know what he was thinking, how he was feeling, to be a part of his world, to feel like I was really alive. And then he suddenly asked, "What makes you feel alive, Jenny?" I looked around trying to figure out the answer, but I realized that I didn't know. When was the last time I really felt happy? I tried to remember, but Nate stood before me again with his indifference and silence. I'm not even sure. I don't even know how to get those feelings back. I was telling the truth, even though I didn't know how to explain why I was sharing it with someone I barely knew. Sean nodded as if he understood perfectly what I meant. Sometimes those feelings really go away, he said softly. But that doesn't mean they can't come back. Maybe sometimes we need a change to feel life again. We walked around the city together for a long time, and I realized that with every step my confidence in him only grew. Even when we were silent, I felt something new with him. No masks, no pretending. And as the sun started to set, I knew it was time to go home. And we were standing on a street corner, and Sean looked at me like he didn't want the day to end either. But he didn't insist. He just looked at me and said, "If fate wills, we'll meet again," he said, and there was that soft smile on his face that made my heart ache again. I barely made myself turn and walk away. I came home, and I felt a slight shiver. Not from the cold, but from the excitement, from the thought that somewhere in this city there was a person who saw in me something that no one else had seen for a long time. When I came home, Nate was at home, and he hardly looked at me. We talked about trifles, and I felt like all my energy, all the light that had been with me all day, was melting away in his silence. It was so quiet, so empty, and he asked me where I was, and I said I was walking, and he nodded, not paying much attention, and I was like I was seeing our lives from the other side. Two people who used to love each other, but now just live in the same house, and that night, lying in bed next to Nate, I was thinking about Sean again. I felt like I was needed, heard, and understood, and I was tormented by guilt, but I couldn't help but think about him. And I tried to convince myself that it was just a casual hobby, that in a few days I'd forget about it. But something inside me was telling me that this story was just beginning, and I was lying there looking at the ceiling, feeling completely lost, not knowing where to go next, not knowing how to be. And the next day I was having a hard time getting my mind together, and Nate left early in the morning, and I felt relieved when I closed the door behind him. The house finally filled with silence, where I could be alone with myself, but it was a strange, heavy silence, too much like loneliness. I poured myself coffee, but even the taste of it didn't help me wake up. The thoughts of Sean overshadowed everything. Our conversations, his smile, the way he looked at me, as if he understood all my unspoken words. I've been so used to feeling insignificant for the past few years that I've almost forgotten what it's like to be truly interested, and I sat in the kitchen, holding a cup with both hands, and I tried to sort through my thoughts, and the thought of Sean was bothering me, like I was doing something that wasn't right, and my conscience was torturing me every minute. But how can you blame yourself for feeling that someone is able to see you for who you are? Not as part of your life, not as someone's debt or obligation, but as a living person? It's just friendship, I kept telling myself. Just a few conversations. But I felt that there was something more between us, something that I could not explain in words. Every time I met him, every sentence he said, it was like I was coming back to life. And by noon, I decided that the only way to get rid of that feeling was to do something useful. And I started cleaning the closets. I tried to distract myself, but the guilt was constant. And I thought, who am I blaming? In front of Nate, who had already cooled off, in front of a marriage that had become more like a coexistence, or in front of myself. Every time I thought about Sean, I felt a surge of energy like I was finding the lost parts of myself. But Nate and I had been bonded for years. We started together, we supported each other in the early days of his career. We built this life together. We dreamed together, laughed together, supported each other, but it all seemed to dissipate over the years, giving way to a cool silence. And I sat down on the couch, overwhelmed by these thoughts, and the inner conflict tormented me, as if two voices were fighting for my attention, one saying that I had to be faithful to Nate, that I had to shut down this random impulse and put everything back in its place. But another, quieter voice whispered that I didn't deserve to be unhappy, that maybe my happiness was worth fighting for. And by the evening, I was exhausted by this inner struggle, and I wanted to get distracted, so I went for a walk, and I went to the beach where I first met Sean. The cool evening air burned my skin, but I could breathe better here, amidst the cold lights and the faint noise of the city. And I stopped in the same place where we had our first conversation, and I kind of started to memorize every word that he had said. And I don't know how long I stood there, but suddenly I felt someone's presence. I just went out for a breath of fresh air. I said, and the words sounded long even to me. But the truth was that part of me was hoping to meet him. Sean came closer, and I felt again that irresistible peace he brought into my life. We were silent, but that silence wasn't heavy. It was like it was overwhelming us, making everything around us seem unimportant. "Jenny, if you need to talk to me." He left the proposal hanging in the air. He didn't push, he didn't insist, and suddenly I opened up to him about something I had been holding in me for a long time, and I told him about Nate, about how close we once were, but it all just kind of got out of hand. I didn't go into details, but I told him as much as I could, and Sean listened quietly without interrupting. "Sometimes people find it hard to admit that they've changed," he said quietly as I finished. "Sometimes we get so used to our lives that we're afraid to take a step back, even if we know that something better is coming." We stood there for a long time, looking at the water, and I don't remember how, but at one point he took my hand, and it was a simple touch, but it meant so much to me that I couldn't take my eyes off our intertwined fingers, and in that moment I realized that something was happening between us that could no longer be denied. What started as a casual encounter turned into something more, into something that seemed inevitable. "You know, Sean," I started talking, but my voice was shaking, and I looked down. He gently squeezed my hand, letting me know that he didn't need any words. Just know that sometimes change is what gives us the strength to move on. And in his eyes, I saw understanding, and that understanding was the push that I feared and longed for. It's been a week since that night that Sean and I stood on the beach, looking at the cold waves and thinking about what change means. We hadn't seen each other since, but the thought of him was alive in me, dazzling and frightening at the same time, and I couldn't forget how his fingers were intertwined with mine, and the strange ease that came in that moment. It was so simple and at the same time so profound, and these days I was living in two realities. One was the gray, everyday, where I still woke up next to Nate, cooked breakfast, worked, and came home barely noticing the time pass. Another bright, colorful world where I would go back in my mind to every word and gesture Sean said, to his warm look and that brief but endless conversation on the waterfront. And one night, when Nate was late at work, I felt this call again to see Sean, to talk to him, to see if he felt the same way, and I didn't try to convince myself that it was just a casual hobby. I knew that there was more to me than I could explain. I decided to go ahead and get my phone, and after a few moments of hesitation, I dialed the message. "If you don't mind, I'd like to see you." I was just about to send it, and the answer came back. "Of course. I'm in the same cafe where we met last time." When I entered the cafe, he was already waiting for me. When he saw me, Sean stood up, and his eyes were as warm as they had been in our previous meetings, but there was something new and expectant about him, a question that he hadn't asked, but that was floating in the air. We were talking about simple things, almost trivial things, and I thought he didn't want to rush the conversation, but I soon realized that I couldn't stay away anymore. "Sean," I said quietly, interrupting him in the middle of a sentence, and his eyes immediately turned to me. "I can't get you out of my head." These words hung in the air, naked and vulnerable. Sean was silent for a moment, but his eyes were lit up with some sort of quiet happiness. "Me too, Jenny," he finally said, and there was no shadow of doubt in his voice. "All these days, I felt like I had never met anyone closer to you. I felt my heart pounding furiously in my chest. It was a confession that I wasn't ready for, but it finally gave me back my sense of self. I thought it was just a coincidence, something I'd soon forget. I quietly confessed. But the more I think, the clearer I realize that I can't. I kept my mouth shut, afraid to say too much, but he reached out and gently touched my hand. "Sometimes encounters happen that change us," he said, without taking his eyes off me. "I know it's not easy, Jenny. I know we can't just take it and change everything. But I also know that I don't want to lose you." I couldn't take my eyes off his eyes, which read the same determination I felt inside me. We didn't need words. In that silence, in that brief moment, we understood each other. "I have a family, I have a dad, I have an Nate," He squeezed my hand tighter, like he understood all this, that he didn't need me to make any immediate decisions. You know, whatever happens next, I'll be there, he said softly. Just know that you're not alone, and whatever you choose, I'll be there for you. I didn't know that there was anyone in my life who could understand me so deeply, and we were sitting there, holding hands, and I couldn't figure out what to do next. I knew that I had a choice, and no matter what I decided, I couldn't pretend that nothing had changed, and it was a few days since we met at the coffee shop, and I was in a fog ever since, like I was stuck between two worlds. On one side was Nate, our home, the familiar rhythm of life that I had been struggling with but had grown accustomed to, and on the other side was Sean and those vivid, vibrant feelings that I had been deprived of for so long. Sean became a symbol of something real to me, something that had long been buried in routine, but it brought back the feeling that I could be myself, not just part of someone else's life. And Nate, as usual, left early in the morning, came back at night, tired and silent, and his eyes were just as indifferent, and we barely spoke. I tried to convince myself that our relationship could be saved, that I just had to try, but every time I looked at him, I was overwhelmed by the pain of how little we had left in common. I tried to remember how much we loved each other, but it felt like it was a long way away, like I hadn't lived it in my life, and I was alone in the kitchen at night, going through the paperwork and the bills, and I saw a message from Sean again. "How are you?" A simple, short message, but I felt my heart beat immediately. I didn't answer, but the thought of it caught me. His face flashed in my mind, his voice, his hand held his voice, quiet and confident, and I realized that this choice was not just between two men, it was a choice between the life I was deprived of and the life I was used to, and the next day, without telling him, I decided to meet Sean, and maybe I was looking for answers, maybe I didn't know what I wanted, but I had to talk. I found him in the same cafe we were sitting in last time. Sean was surprised to see me, but he smiled and invited me to sit across the table. "Hello," he said softly, and his look immediately soothed my inner doubts. "Good to see you." "Sean, I stopped, feeling I couldn't find the words. I need to figure out what to do next. He leaned closer, and I saw something understanding and warm flashing in his eyes. "I don't want to push you, Jenny," he said, "but I think about it every day, too." I took a breath to say what I had been afraid to say out loud for so long. "You've been the only light for me for so long," I said, and my voice trembled. "But I can't just walk away from Nate. We have commitments, we have a past. I don't know how to break it all, and I'm not sure I have the strength to do it." Sean listened to me quietly, but I could see that he was excited. His eyes were focused, and he seemed to be choosing every word with great care. "I'm never going to ask you to ruin your life for me, but I also want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm going to be there." His words were comforting, but they were also painful. There was a man in front of me who was willing to support me, but my duty to Nate was like pulling me back, not letting me move forward. Nate had been asleep for a long time, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. And that was the moment when I had to be honest first and foremost with myself, and I couldn't lie to myself. Word to Nate, word to Sean, and the next day I got my wits about me, and I decided to talk to Nate. He noticed my excitement when he came home from work, and it seemed like the first time in a long time he had really looked at me. "We need to talk," I said, feeling my voice trembling. We sat down at the table, and I told him everything about how long our relationship had been an empty formality, how lonely I felt. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't talk about Sean because I thought it wouldn't help, and it was too obvious. And when I finished, he was silent for a long time, and it seemed like an endless silence. And finally he looked up and said quietly, "You know, I probably felt that way too, I just didn't want to admit it. We're both in a lot of pain, but I don't want you to be unhappy." His words hit me like I heard something I never expected from him. I saw in his eyes the same loneliness that tormented me. We both felt trapped. We both were afraid to admit it. And now the truth has finally broken down the wall that stands between us. "I understand," I answered quietly. He nodded without being angry or resentful, and we both knew it was the end, and that holding each other back would only be cruel. And we said goodbye without words, and that goodbye was filled with sadness, but at the same time it was a release. I didn't know what was coming next, but I felt like I had finally made the move I was so afraid of. A few days later, when the formalities were settled, I wrote Sean and asked him to meet me. We went for a walk around the city like we did then, and I felt strange and new about feeling free. Sean listened attentively as I told him how our relationship with Nate ended. He took my hand, and I felt the same spark that had once bound us together. "Now you know I'm here," he said as we stopped on the bridge. "We can start over, without looking back." I smiled as I looked into his eyes, and I felt ready to start.